Good morning. My name is Robin Muir, and I will be your moderator today. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Kitsap, I want to welcome you to our brown bag discussion on growth in Kitsap County. Joining us this morning are our county commissioners, Charlotte Garrido, Robert Gelder, and Ed Wolf, and Port Commissioners Cary Bozeman, from Bremerton, and Mary McClure from Kingston. Today's discussion is being recorded by the League of Women Voters Kitsap and will be available for viewing on our website, which is lwv-kitsap.org. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that neither supports nor opposes political parties or candidates. The League does take positions on matters of public policy and advocates for those positions after careful study. Formed in the 1920s as an outgrowth of the women's suffrage movement, the League's purpose was and is to this day to educate and inform citizens so that they may more fully participate in our democracy. As a membership organization, we depend on our members to organize and run events such as this. We invite and encourage everyone to become members and help us work toward the League's basic belief that our form of government depends upon the informed and active participation of its citizens. We will take questions after our discussion today, and we would ask that you submit those via the chat and stick to the topics that we're discussing today. To begin, what I would like to do is have each of our commissioners, we'll start with our county commissioners and then go to our port commissioners and give a brief summary of the respective plans for growth in their areas, if that would be okay. And we'll start with Ed Wolf, if that would be.
So the question has to do with growth in our area?
Well, what are the current plans and where is and growth in Bremerton?
And how are we going to pay for it?
Well, that would be important too.
If we're on the same page, I think all three of us will jump in to that question, but I'll just start out by saying that we provide services throughout the whole county from multiple federal, state, and local sources. And our budget last year was about, this year is about $428 million. A majority of it's dedicated to roads and wastewater and stormwater, as well as law and justice. And most of this revenue comes from property and sales tax. I don't know if Rob and Charlotte want to jump in at this point or want me to continue, please.
Oh, go ahead and continue.
When we reached COVID-19 a couple of years ago, of course, the pandemic disrupted our lives completely, but the budget was one of our principal concerns. We took quick action. I think we did remarkably well. I keep saying that over the months, but it was one of our biggest concerns, but we took quick action and we continue with our key services. Our key services, not just for health, but for everything we do in the county, and very proud of what we did. Someone may on my team or our team may want to jump in on capital facilities. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think I would, if it's okay, Robin.
Go right ahead.
Jump in, sort of similar. Budget, obviously, in the county's capacity is definitely key. But maybe to take a step back in terms of where development, where growth will be occurring, it's more foundational, I think, in many ways, because we operate as all jurisdictions within the state under the Growth Management Act, and some are fully planning, like Kitsap County, others are not. But for our intents and purposes, we have that overarching umbrella of the Growth Management Act. And then we partner or participate in the region with the Puget Sound Regional Council, where we then create those high-level goals and policies under what is now the Vision 2050, which are also known as our multi-county planning policies. Those trickle on down to the Kitsap Regional Coordinating Council and our county-wide planning policies, which are just in the process of being wrapped up in terms of ratification. But they really kind of create those aspirational goals that each one of the jurisdictions, whether we're the county or we're a city, try to plan on and plan for. So we all are on the same cycle for updating, and we have our next periodic update in June of 2024. But that really kind of sets the framework for how do we determine where, and we're actually right in the throes of it, so this question is pretty timely. We've done the buildable lands report. We are now in the spring, in the coming months, we'll start negotiating or working with our partners in the county about where will the population be going, that we have a population allocation we need to absorb and plan for over the next planning horizon. And so we will be having that conversation. But under GMA, the development is going to go to those urban areas. And we, in just looking back in the buildable lands report, we have started to really make a discernible shift. We're not all the way there, but we're making a discernible shift that most of the growth and the development is happening in the urban areas, whether it's a city or it's an unincorporated urban growth area.
Charlotte?
Wow, these guys covered an awful lot of it. So I'll drill down just a little bit more specifically because they've kind of given you the pattern. And so we have to make sure that we're including concerns for development and our natural resources, as well as economic development, human services, transportation networks, et cetera. And so that means that we are talking with many other agencies, many we are on the board of, such as Kitsap Transit and Housing Kitsap, et cetera. And we do need, each of us, to work with the local cities within our own jurisdiction of Kitsap County so that we are helping to integrate their needs and plans for the future with what we're doing. We do know that we're facing a housing crisis here in Kitsap County, that our population continues to grow and that there needs to be some additional attention to housing. One of my particular interests is in housing types and making sure that we don't necessarily just cling to the old patterns, that we consider how we might grow into the future in additional ways. But balancing housing with employment, local employment is important. We know that we do have a lot of people who travel to Seattle to work, but Kitsap has really enhanced our employment base in recent years, and I think that deserves a lot more attention and discussion locally.
Cary, do you want to talk about port plans for growth?
Yeah, but let me jump up 20,000 feet real quick, and then I'll talk about the port, because the port's part of the community, obviously. And what I think everyone on this dais understands is that we're going to see significant growth in the next 25 years in Kitsap County. If we grow at 1.5% a year, we're going to double our population or get close to it. So we're going to go from a community of 250,000 to maybe 500,000 people. And the question will be, how do we maintain the quality of life for this community that we all love here and the reasons we stay here and we moved here? That'll be the question. In 20 or 25 years, I'm old enough to remember being in a lot of growth spurts in the Pacific Northwest. It goes fast. And the issue is going to be, two of the main issues will be transportation. I think Gorst is probably getting to the top of that list pretty quickly. And then the housing, the county, and I applaud the county looking into a 1% sales tax or 0.1% sales tax for affordable housing. I think that's a good vision to have, and I think it's a good thing to do. Our ferry system today is in a crisis. I mean, I don't know if you read all three, even the Seattle Times is writing front page stories about the crisis in the ferry system. And it used to be, and my wife's a ferry rider and every day, it used to be that 99% of the schedule was on time. That's dropped to almost 75%. And it's just been tragic what's happened in the ferry system. And they've been underfunded for 25 years, ever since they were they had dedicated funding out of the car tab. And when the state got out of, by and large, gave that authority to the local governments, there has been no dedicated resource for ferries. So we have a big transportation challenge coming up. And we have we have a big housing issue, and I just want to talk about that for a minute. I worked in, when I was working for the Boys and Girls Club of King County, I had my office in Pioneer Square in Seattle at 80 on First and Cherry. And back in 84, we were starting to experience homelessness. And it was getting to the point where you didn't want your employees walking by themselves at night to their car. It was very intimidating. But over the last 30 years, Seattle just never faced the issue head on, didn't appropriate the resources they needed. Now they have a real crisis, and they're really fumbling around and spending a lot of money to try to figure out. So we're just beginning to see that here. So I think this whole issue of affordable housing that allows people to stay off the street is a big deal. And I applaud the county, and I think also Paulsbo has taken up a 1/10 I think that's critical. I was at the Salvation Army the other day, and they are putting 60 mats down at night for homeless people. And some of those people have the flu, they don't feel well, they don't want to be there. It's just a real problem. So those are some of the big issues that we see. As to the ports are, I think there's 60 of them in the county. They're special purpose governments with the mission to create job opportunities, create jobs, bring in new companies to improve the economy for a region. Because if there's anything that's social about what we do, it's help us create jobs for people. I mean, if you don't have a job, you're not going to pay your rent, and you're not going to get, you're not going to have medical, and you're all these other things. So we're not only in the job creation business, we're in the business of allowing people to have a quality of life that they might not otherwise have. So we have three main parts of our business. We have a general aviation airport, which is one of the best general aviation airports, I think, in the country. We have a large industrial park that's probably got more acreage than most other industrial parks. We have 1,200 acres. Today, in that industrial park, we have over 65 companies with 2,800 employees generating a lot of payroll and a lot of tax. And then we're into the boating marina business. We have two big marinas. One has 400, one can take full. We have about 900 boats and slips right now. And I'm happy to say that all our boats slips are full. We haven't had that for a long time, because boating, during COVID, boating became kind of a way that people felt comfortable recreating. So there's a lot of people boating these days, and that'll probably continue. Our business is very robust, and I think one of the reasons we're seeing so much interest in our industrial park is the large amount of work that's coming to the shipyard. The shipyard is hiring people every day, but the big part is they're going to receive billions, in the billions, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, I'm not sure what it is, to help upgrade that old shipyard. And so a lot of contractors, a lot of people looking for lay down yards, a lot of that kind of thing. So the port right now is very healthy, and I'm happy to report we've got a great staff. Jim Rotland is our CEO, and he's just doing a great job. So, I mean, we're going to grow. We anticipate that. A lot of challenges. We've got one little highway that goes out that connects us to the rest of the world. And we've got Amazon that's come out there with I don't know how many 100 trucks every day. And then our yard is growing every day. So more and more pressure is going on the highway to Belfair every day. So that's going to be a big issue, as well as Gorse. So lots of transportation and housing. We have 2,800 employees. We're looking for housing.
So we're going to circle back around to that housing issue, because that is going to be a big.
I don't know if, one of the thoughts, maybe we should be, I shouldn't say this because my other commissioners would be mad at me. Maybe we should be building some workforce housing, or at least providing the land for a developer to do it.
So Mary, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. The Port of Kingston is nowhere near the scale of the Port of Bremerton, but Kingston is an urban growth area. We are incredibly well poised for growing in terms of our public infrastructure, in terms of library and community center and schools and so on and so forth. And I think the other piece that adds to that is that we're not only an urban growth area, but we're also a transportation hub. And so that means not only more population, but it means that we really need to make sure that that transportation hub works. And as we look at growth, as we look at more population coming, fixing the ferry traffic, which bottlenecks up every day over and over. If you drive around in between ferries, there's very little traffic, but the minute, the ferry comes anywhere near, it's backed up. And we've been working on this issue for decades. And I think we're on the verge of the first major step in solving that problem. Are we going to come back to talking about transportation in particular?
We are.
Okay, so I won't go into all the details on that at this point, but we're anticipating on our footprint some pretty important upgrade for the town. And our focus is, yes, we're very aware of bringing in new jobs, but we're also have a strong focus on supporting the businesses and jobs that exist. Kingston, over probably 20 years, but particularly during COVID, lost a lot of vitality in terms of local business. And being a gateway to not only Kitsap, Kingston, and the Olympic Peninsula, but we need very much to make sure that our local businesses benefit from that. And so the upgrades that we're looking at on our port property are really focused on enhancing the community, adding some lodging, adding a new restaurant, and I can talk about this in more detail as we go forward, but we're looking over the next 3 to 4 years to see a new Port of Kingston facility.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about all this growth. We've got thousands of housing project, I should say, houses that are going to be built in proposed subdivisions and that are in various stages of the permitting process. How much of that will be affordable housing? Because we need to have, I think, housing that is going to be something that the people who work here can afford to live in. So what percentage of our housing is going to be affordable, and where would that be located? And we'll go back to Ed Wolf again to start the...
So we're talking about the question directly to affordable housing in Kitsap County.
And where would that be located?
Yeah, I think most of us realize, I'm sure everyone on the panel realizes that the Growth Management Act actually requires us, governments, local and county, to provide sufficient housing for all economic segments. And Kitsap County, currently, we don't have regulations requiring affordable housing in private development. Generally, it's being incentivized by certain local codes, but it's at the option of developer, I should say. There is federal funding for affordable housing. As Commissioner Gelder knows, he's chairman of Housing Kitsap. Our local housing authorities, as well as many nonprofit providers, their primary mission is to construct and oversee affordable housing in Kitsap County. I can talk about the 1/10 of 1%, but Rob, Charlotte, do you want to talk about the 1/10 of 1%? I think it's on the top of our radar right now. It was Monday night anyway, and we'll have a decision on that probably early January. If one of you would like to address the 1/10 of 1% sales tax increase for affordable housing.
Who wants
Well, certainly. Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. As Commissioner Bozeman mentioned, the city of Paulsville already took action earlier this year. They'll start collecting the additional taxes at January 1st, but the county on Monday night had our hearing for the potential of a 0.1% sales and use tax for affordable housing specifically, which the legislature has provided this as a tool to local governments to do. They made some tweaks in the last session that provided some additional flexibility, but it's not only for the construction of the affordable housing, but it's also for helps to cover some of the costs for the operations of them. So you can think of Pendleton Place in Bremerton, where it's permanent supportive housing. It could be a potential source for some of those operations ongoing. The challenge being, and just to let folks know in terms of the timeline, is that we've left the record open for written testimony through the end of this month at close of business on the 31st of December, and then we will be deliberating on Monday the 3rd of January, and then bringing it back for decision only at our evening meeting on the 10th of January. So that's just so everyone knows kind of the timeline for that discussion. But it is definitely a tool that is extremely important as we continue to try to bend the curve on affordable housing in our community. And that is one of the biggest challenges that whether you're housing Kitsap, whether you're Bremerton Housing Authority, and some other low-income housing provider, it's access to capital, which is one of the impediments. I mean, land obviously is a big part of it, but it's also the ability to construct it, because as we all know, it's not inexpensive to do. And most of this will come in the shape of some type of multifamily housing. And so therefore, by the nature of the Growth Management Act, it's going to direct that affordable housing and that multifamily housing to our cities and our urban growth areas. And I think I'd like to ask Commissioner Garrido, she mentioned earlier, so one of her areas of interest is really the housing types, because that truly does tie into the affordable housing component too. Right now, you know, our average, when we look at our permitting, our average square footage for a house now is like around 2,200 square feet.
Pardon me?
It's 2,200 square feet, which is up from a previous average of 1,700. And so we have a lot of larger homes that are coming on the landscape, which by virtue of square footage is affordable for a certain segment, but not as affordable for all. So I don't know if Commissioner Garrido would like to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, I believe
you're muted, Charlotte.
This mute and unmute thing, sorry. I'd love to talk about this. Actually, the whole range of housing is something that we need to be talking about. And so, frankly, the League of Women Voters would be really, really well situated to help us have more public discourse about housing types. And one of my favorite recent books is this one called Missing Middle Housing. Can you see that? Because too often we kind of resort to the old style, the same sorts of single family housing on a certain scale. And it's really important that as we look at the fact that we also want to preserve our environment, the natural setting that we live in, that we take a real close look at the housing that is crossing our landscape, and determine if there aren't some other types, some ways that we can be living in houses that we enjoy, but that maybe don't have to be quite as large or spacious as they currently are. And so this book gives us some ideas, and I think that public discourse about the options is something that has been missing for quite some time. And if we began to have that kind of discussion, I think more of us would bear responsibility for the kind of landscape that we are creating during our own lifetimes as we look not only backward before us, but into the future. And how long can we keep building in the same scale and the same separations that we currently do, and still have a landscape that we look out the window and appreciate. So that's something that I would really, really love to encourage and to participate in.
Robin, if
Yes.
Just, I wanted to make a note as well that I forgot, is that, the legislature often continues to change what the requirements are under the Growth Management Act and our comprehensive planning. So there are some new requirements around housing that will be implemented as part of the 2024 update. And right now is probably the best time over the next couple of years for folks to get involved and really be able to lend their voices to this whole housing conversation, as we will be embarking down that road very quickly. And Ed, I didn't know if you wanted to mention sort of our recent success with.
I did. I was hoping you would give me that opportunity, and this will be quick, I promise.
It's fine.
And that has to do, I think you're referring to our Dickey Pitt. We passed this week, I guess, a development agreement with a local developer, Dickey Pitt, a milestone in that we approved this particular development to require 10% affordable housing. And I know I'm going to be corrected. I think I'm right, but this is the first time in the county that in a governmental entity, county or city, has required a percentage of a development to be devoted to affordable housing. Is that what you were talking about, Rob? Hopefully.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Ed, can the developer give cash rather than put the affordable housing in their development? Yeah. Yeah, I'll make a quick point. I know we're all aware of this. I think apartments used to be that interim step for a lot of people getting out of college, young people, low income people, and they were affordable. And Section 8 was available for people, and Section 8 would pretty much pay the cost of their low incomes, so to speak, apartment. Well, none of that's true anymore. Most apartments that are being built in our area here are going to rent from $1,200 to $1,700 a month. That is not affordable for somebody making $50,000 or $60,000. So I don't, and nobody's building. I remember apartments not that long ago, $800, and you could rent in Bremerton all day long. Well, you can't find an apartment for $800, and you probably can't find any more Section 8 vouchers. So, probably a lot of us pay less than that on our home mortgage that we bought, 20 years ago. So this high price for apartments is going to be a critical challenge for us. And the other thing I would say, and I know everybody on the commissioners would agree with this is a regional issue. It shouldn't be dealt with city by city, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. This is a total regional issue, and the plan should, everybody should involve themselves in the planning for this different types of housing that we're going to have to build in the next 20 years.
I'd like to ask a follow-up of Commissioner Garrido and Mike. See if I can say this. The missing middle when we're talking about building smaller homes, because I can see how, first of all, our land is finite. We only have X amount, and we do want to preserve green space. So is it possible to mandate building sizes for homes? I'm confused by that.
Actually, I think it is. And actually, the subtitle of this book is Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. And so that's exactly what they're talking about, is that maybe we do need to model some examples of living spaces that are perfectly desirable and yet maybe smaller than those that are mostly currently on the market. I have to tell a little story though about, we talked about maybe the size of houses. when I was a college student at the University of Oregon, I was self-supporting and I needed to live someplace inexpensively. The first year I was able to live in a cooperative. So they had fraternities and sororities, they had dorms, and they had cooperative housing where folks who might not be able to afford much housing around the university lived in former dorms or former sororities and fraternity buildings that had been purchased by the university and were subsidized a certain amount. And those of us who lived there did not pay as much as dorms were. And yet we did some of the work in the cleaning and the dishwashing, not necessarily the cooking, but some of those daily tasks that helped reduce the costs that we paid and still made sure the services were provided at the building. That's something that doesn't even exist there anymore. But as I got more independent, I was able to live in we would today call it a tiny house. And it was perfectly comfortable to be living that close to campus and have a very, very small space, which I didn't fill with a lot of stuff because I didn't have the space nor the money to provide it with stuff. And it was a very comfortable way for me to be able to live independently as I was a student. And I think those are the kinds of things that we should be looking at today.
True. Very true. We have to think outside the box a little bit and come up with some alternative solutions and things that maybe have not been traditional, but maybe we need to go back and look at some of, I should say, traditional in recent times. But if we go back to the 1950s and we look at house sizes and sizes of closets, it was a less consumer-oriented society, and it makes a huge difference. I'd like to move on. I know that Kitsap County is going to be the recipient of some monies from the recent infrastructure bill that has passed. And I thought maybe you could all address how you might be beneficiaries of that money and where it would then be used. Mary. Oh, Mary, I believe you're on mute.
Before we move into that, I just wanted to make a couple of pieces brought up so far. The first is that I was intrigued by the people that came and presented, did public comment for the commissioners, the county commissioners, affordable housing tax bill earlier. And one developer talked about how he could do Section 8 vouchers forever, but he can't find supply. And I really took that home with me, that it is a supply issue. So that's the first thing. Somebody else talked about the importance of the definition of affordable housing and of eligibility for affordable housing. And I think these are important pieces for us to be paying attention to, very similar to what Commissioner Garrido just said, but also in terms of remembering that it has to be affordable for a whole range of people. And a lot of people think of affordable housing as low income, and other people think of it as, oh, I only make $70,000 a year. How am I going to afford a house? And I think there's a whole spectrum we need to be paying attention to. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the city of Bainbridge, I want to say 15 or 20 years ago, had a requirement that housing development of a certain size in terms of number of units had to set aside, I think it was 10 or 15% for affordable housing. And I don't know if they're still doing that, but I think Commissioner Garrido's concept about having a lot of public discourse, that would be a really useful thing for us to understand what actually occurred there. Okay, those were the comments I wanted to make based on the previous discussion, and now we can move on.
So think Build Back Better and the funding that we might be receiving for infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think it's, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I just jump. For a point of clarification, Build Back Better actually hasn't been approved yet.
Well, that's true.
That's right.
infrastructure bill.
Right, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Yeah,
Yes,
The
yeah.
one
That's
that
true.
we do know about.
Thank you.
We know about it. We may not be able to give you much information about it today, but I will just say that some of us remember, most of us probably would remember Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, years ago. And Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. Nothing could be more local, at least in our world, the county, than roads, sewers, et cetera, et cetera. So this package, the federal package, the infrastructure, I think was $1 million, $1.2 million, $1.4 million, something like that, recently passed, and that's for construction of federal, state, local infrastructure, such as roads, sewers, and the others. We don't have any answer, at least I don't have an answer in terms of when we're going to receive that money, how much it's going to be, but I know we'll keep working with our delegation in Washington and our state delegation, certainly a federal delegation, to make sure that Kitsap continues to do as well as I think it's done in the past in infrastructure type funding and transportation type funding. I could go on, but Rob and Shaw, I'm sure you would like to jump in there somewhere.
Well, I think unlike the recent ARPA or the recovery, dollars that were actually our direct allocation to jurisdictions, where Kitsap County received a direct appropriation. This is not the case. The infrastructure dollars are going to go through various agencies and existing programs, or they'll create other programs. Where we will probably see it, whether it's broadband, et cetera, there will be some type of either a formula program or a competitive grant program where we'll see the distribution of those dollars. And most likely for Kitsap County, outside of potential state usage of dollars they receive, we'll probably see that through the Puget Sound Regional Council and potentially additional funding to the regional competition, and or I'm hopeful that we might, because the decision hasn't been made yet, that we might see a bump to our countywide competition when that comes around, so that we could potentially invest in additional projects that are on that list or part of that competition. But we're in a pool of competing with everybody else, most likely, and so there's no guarantee at this point in time.
A lot of hands out, but perhaps not enough pieces of the pie. Mary, would the port benefit in any way, or are you have to be self-supporting?
Not necessarily directly. There would not be a particular amount that came to the port. But if there is additional funding in the transportation or any of these other sources, then yeah, the port is eligible to apply. And we're looking at, the bulk of our revenue comes from our lease with the state ferry system for the dock, with Kitsap Transit for their dock for the passenger ferry, some marina revenue from tenants, and we've had a waiting list for years, Cary. So I think we anticipate seeing some of those funds, but and then of course tax revenue we also get. So but I don't think that we're looking at a big windfall that's going to suddenly come to the port to use.
Cary, did you want to add something?
Yeah, we have a major capital project staring us in the face the next couple of years. We have to replace the Port Orchard breakwater, which will be $15 million, which is a big capital investment for us. So we've already got our lobbyists, and we've already been talking to our federal officials, and we're trying to get our oar in the water as best we can. One of the things interesting about some of these bills that are passed and trying to pass is that the prognosticators are talking about maybe Republicans taking over Congress next year, and how that would affect some of the things that basically the Democrats have passed. No one knows at this point. So whether or not those dollars for infrastructure, or if they happen to pass this bill back better, whether or not that's still going to be as available as was intended. So, but I think the infrastructure is something that's popular on both sides of the aisle. I think there's a good chance that that will stay in place, and if it does, then the port will be doing all we can to secure some funding for our new breakwater in Port Orchard.
So moving on with, Mary, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment that the Port of Kingston is also looking at basically marina replacement within the next 20 to 25 years. And so that's a huge, huge impact on our budget and planning as well.
So with transportation issues are surely going to follow new development. We're going to have a lot more people using our roads and other infrastructure. So what are the plans for infrastructure in terms of highways and moving people throughout the county? And where would funding from this come from?
Rob, you want to start that one?
Well, I can start. So the challenge, when we talk about sort of the road or the transportation component of infrastructure, there's definitely a distinction between that which is under the auspices of the county or a city jurisdiction, right? So we have most anything that is new relative to infrastructure, roadways within of the unincorporated area is, say if it's in Silverdale, then most of those roadways often get constructed as part of a development project, and then they are deeded to the county for long-term maintenance. So the funding for those usually is borne for the maintenance and preservation of our road system comes from our road levy. That is our primary source. That is with all of our property taxes are capped at 1%, do not keep up with the inflationary costs of labor or materials, et cetera. So our ability to maintain our system continues to erode. There is less that we can do each and every year. So that is a challenge. I would say that, and Mary, when we were talking about traffic up in Kingston, probably a large part of our attention, whether it's Highway 305, 104, and Ferry backup, whether it's the Gorse corridor, et cetera, most of the time and attention and energy we put into advocating and lobbying for resources is really around the state-owned and operated infrastructure. So the challenge there is that we have a position of influence. We don't have a position of actually appropriating dollars for any of that work to happen. When it comes to Kingston, the county, put our necks out there early on to apply for funding to actually start doing the preliminary engineering for the realignment of 104 in Kingston. We were fortunate to get an appropriation with Senator Rolfus's assistance that the port then ended up managing the dollars to do the feasibility for a remote holding lot and an automated traffic management system that I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get some funding to implement that in the next couple of years. So there are funds out there, but most of it is still competitive outside of a transportation package, which did not happen last session, likely will not happen. We've got a new Senate transportation chair in Senator Elias, likely not to come together in a short session in 2022, maybe 2023, don't know, but then it's trying to figure out what projects are on that. So it's incumbent upon us as representing our various jurisdictions in partnership with the cities and the port is identifying what are those lists of priority projects that are often fall down to where the capacity is needed. So we're talking about sort of preservation projects and capacity projects. Those often trickle down to the state highways, and that's where we see the biggest impact.
I'd just like to jump in and say that I think certainly at the Kitsap Regional Coordinating Council, we've had some conversations about how essential the Gorst Corridor is to all of Kitsap County and, oh, by the way, also to the Olympic Peninsula. So that's been named as a high priority in some of our discussions and probably will continue to be talked about.
Yep. I would just add one thing if I could, Robert. And that is, we talk about the funding, and you've heard mentioned quite a few times today, all of us, Puget Sound Regional Council. The three commissioners serve on different boards with the Puget Sound Regional Council, and much of the transportation funding anyway originates there, and they allocate that. It's very, very, very competitive in Kitsap County for funding. And when I say competitive, I mean collaboratively. But we've got Port Orchard, as we know, we've got Bremerton, we've got Paulsville, Bainbridge Island. We're all going after a similar pot that originates from, or not originates, but it's funneled through the Puget Sound Regional Council. And I'm just throwing out the point that it's very competitive, but collaborative as we speak today anyway, for the funding.
And could I add to that? That's a good point, Commissioner. We're also competing with a diminishing pot of resources. The state transportation budget is funded basically out of gas tax, and that gas tax is diminishing as people, commute, work from their home, or they're driving electric cars, or those kind of things. So this legislation is going to have, they're going to have a big challenge figuring out how to fund the transportation budgets in this state. Currently, they have a huge deficit in projects that have been projected that are going unfunded. Ferries are one of them. And where on the other hand, the general fund is very robust in this state. They're doing well. They have a big reserve. And I'm sure that the Republican side, at least I read this, is going to try to take some transportation money out of the general fund. That'll be a interesting debate. But basically, the state of Washington, which has the highest gas tax in the country, I think, or one of them, it's just not working to fund transportation anymore, and they're going to have to look at other avenues to fund transportation. The cities have been able to, put this car tab at $20 or $25, which basically gives them some money for paving streets. Not enough, and they can only pave a few each year. But before that, most cities had not enough money to pave streets, much less put in new streets. So cities struggle with transportation. The state struggles with it. We're falling farther behind all the time. It's a big challenge in how to fund transportation.
I'd like to comment that the funding of transportation, I know some of the public works directors groan when they see, a non-motorized set aside, et cetera. But I think what we will also see with the influx of people from the urban side of the Sound and younger people is a higher willingness to utilize transit and non-motorized. And transit, non-motorized complement ferries and the road system. And I think the more robust those are, the more likelihood we will be able to transfer some of the transportation demand in that direction. And I'm thinking in terms of transit as being not just the standard routed service and access. I mean, those are all very nice, but I know Kingston could really use a shuttle service that went around town and on a regular basis, pretty frequent. I'm in conversation with the director, John Clausen, about the idea of doing the volunteer model where Kitsap Transit trains and provide drivers and provides the equipment, and then it's a volunteer pool that actually drives a shuttle bus. That would make a tremendous difference to parking as well as people getting the short jaunts into town. because the size of our urban growth area, the boundaries for high intensity development are within a shuttle ride. And so it really is quite feasible. And I think I get all of the funding constraints. I totally get that. But I think we have to look at the fact that it's not necessarily the same big car, gas guzzler dominated transportation world that we all grew up with and are used to. So.
Thank you. Excellent point. I'm going to switch over to the environment for a minute, and then we'll start looking at some of the questions that are in the chat. There are several. My question is the environmental impact or carbon footprint being considered or evaluated when we put in these new subdivisions or in any new growth? And then how do you determine that, what that carbon footprint might be?
That's a question that could go on for hours, trying to identify what the issue is. How do you fix the issue? But I know that our county completed a climate resiliency assessment sometime last year, and it highlighted measures to discuss for future planning in this regard. And what that means is to evaluate the impacts to climate change. We actually executed an agreement with King, Pearson, and Snohomish counties to assess the greenhouse gas emissions and how these emissions would be impacted as growth continues. That was last year. Commissioner Gelder, Commissioner Garrido?
I think that to add on to that, Commissioner Wolf, the part of that, the reason why we went into that consortium of really trying to understand it is that we, in terms of the planning environment, have new and ongoing requirements under the Growth Management Act related to greenhouse gases and climate change. So it is something we have to get our hands around to try to be able to quantify it and then be able to take that into consideration as we move forward. One of the things that we're doing right now, actually, or in the coming year, we're looking at, our staff are working on codes related to bike facilities and electric vehicle infrastructure, and new development and or redevelopment of properties, making sure that we do have the infrastructure in place to support that. And getting back to Commissioner Bozeman's comment about sort of those diminishing resources, one of those things that will actually probably come into play, the legislature will have to implement, is the road usage charge. For right now, there is a differential in registrations for electric vehicles, which isn't enough, right? There's got to be another way to really make sure that we do that. So climate change will be one of those chapters that we have really robust conversations around in our upcoming comp plan update.
Yeah.
Here at the county level as well as at the regional council level.
Out at the port, my fellow commissioners probably wouldn't want me talking about this, but I've been thinking, and I think some other people, about alternative energy sources. There are airports around the country that have created solar farms on their property, and we have a lot of property, and we have a lot of buildings that require lots of energy, and it's very costly. Big industrial buildings, that Puget Power would just as soon get them off the grid probably. But, I'm trying to encourage my commissioners to take a look at this solar issue. It is happening around the country, and if we could build enough of it where it could impact the cost of not only the global warming, but also the cost to our people renting our spaces, then that's a win-win. So I'm hoping that this year we'll have a good conversation about finding a site where we could build our first solar farm.
All right. Pardon?
I like it.
Me too.
I have to agree that we have to be thinking this way. We can't the status quo isn't working, I guess. We have several questions that run the gamut. This one is there a discussion of reuse or redesign of commercial buildings into affordable housing in urban areas as more people work from home and there is potentially less demand for commercial buildings?
Well, let me just start by talking about in South Kitsap, we are creating a shelter in a former gym. And that's something that we expect to have up and running in the next few months.
That's
Mary,
correct.
did you have a comment?
Yeah, there's a burnt out motel in downtown Kingston that is being looked at as possible turning it into affordable housing. We're looking at that. We're looking around town. I work with the Kingston Affordable Housing Work Group, and we're looking carefully all around town, thinking about where we might be able to do that. So, yeah.
And there's actually a commercial office building in Keyport that is for sale, and somebody actually went through the due diligence of how to redesign that from commercial office space into smaller efficiency apartments.
Yeah.
And so there are examples like that around, but it ultimately boils down to, is there a willing property owner or is there a willing investor that will then purchase it and do that work to make it happen? There's nothing on the books, on code, where you can actually force a commercial property owner to do something different.
Right.
I'm going to throw a real stretcher on this question out. It was a good question, and it has to do with commercial building redesign. We just had a meeting this morning after we've been working 2 years on a new courthouse in Kitsap County that was built in the 40s, antiquated and needs to be replaced. We hope to go to design on that new courthouse next year and then start construction, design and permitting and construction in 2023. It's a $60 million project, and it was raised this morning. In certain areas, there will be a redesign to the earlier designs of the courthouse because of COVID and what we've gone through the past 2 years, at least the last 2 years. So it may not go directly to the environmental side, but there will be environmental parts of that. But we're redesigning our old design from the new courthouse that will be built in the near future.
I want to go back to the affordable housing issue real quick. We all know what affordable housing is supposed to be. Is someone wouldn't be paying more than 40% of their annual income for their rent. But I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about homelessness. And I'll go back to my story of working in Seattle in the 80s, and that was before the tents came up on the sidewalks, and all the parks were full of tents and those kind of things, and the drugs and the needles. And, we're starting to see some of that already. We're starting to see people on the street. We know we have kids on the street. And as part of this conversation, I think we really need to assume that we're going to have some of that. And it's not just, we should learn. You can't turn on the television in Seattle at night without a story about homelessness. Green Lake's got an encampment, and all the parks got an encampment. Encampments right next to schools. And it would be foolish, I think, for us to pretend that might not happen here. And when it begins to happen, and I think as part of this home issue, homeless, affordable, we need to have some solutions for what we're going to do when that starts to happen in a real way. And I'm sure it will.
Acting proactively instead of reactively. Couple more housing questions, and I think that the homelessness issue it could fill up a whole nother discussion time. It's such a big issue, and it's of critical importance. And I agree with you that the way that our current times are, that we might have to really address that sooner rather than later. This one is, it seems to me that we also need more one-story homes because we have an aging population that requires maybe smaller, but all on one level housing. That's just a comment more than anything. And then another one, this is about variances being given to developers that then, let me read it. As county commissioners, can you intervene? Oh, I'm sorry. We recently had an experience of requesting that a variance not be given to a developer who wanted to build a large house on a lot that would infringe on wetlands. There was sufficient space on the lot for a smaller home, yet the county gave the variance. As county commissioners, can you intervene in these kinds of practices that are being done by county employees? It seems that as county commissioners, you could take action immediately to require that the county employees stop giving variances and stick to the original rules that were set up to protect the environment and the general public. There seems to be a tendency among county employees to give these types of benefits to developers at the expense of the public and the environment. What are your thoughts on this?
That's an explosive question.
Yes.
If I may start, the county has the permit authority for unincorporated Kitsap County, representing urban and rural areas, so roughly 175,000 people. Bainbridge, Paulsville, Port Orchard, Bremerton, they have jurisdiction also. Permit applications, and I think that's what this person is going to, are reviewed with our current Kitsap County code for compliance. And that's where we go to. We go to our codes, and it's a complicated question. It's a good question, and that's the best answer I can give you right now. We'll continue going to our code as we know it today in terms of variances, and decisions ultimately reach up to the Board of County Commissioners, and not always.
Yeah, I would say that, from a land use perspective, if there is a variance that's allowed by code, and there are parameters usually within the code that identify what needs to be met for the property owner, the developer, the builder to receive that variance, if they're able to meet that, because it's allowed by code, it would then be very subjective to say, well, you can't have it because we don't want you to have it. If it's actually allowed by code, we are legally bound to be able to provide that path for them. If there's an issue with the variance in the codes, then we need to approach it that way and make modifications to the code such that moving forward, that situation doesn't happen. But ultimately, there is a fine line that we have to walk when it comes to the development of code and restrictions in the balancing that with personal property rights. So it is tough too, and yes, it's the same thing we could say, that just because you can fit a 3,000 to 5,000 square foot home on a lot, would you, could you, should you? It's such a personal thing. I personally live in 1,000 square feet, and that's totally works, right? But everybody is different. But if I could build that 3,000 square foot house, is it incumbent upon the county to say, no, you don't need that much space? It is really difficult between that personal choice, private property rights, and the role that government has.
So when those variances are given and maybe building does impact on wetlands, are there mitigation requirements that are established by the county?
Sure. There's always that give and take, and you have to meet those certain requirements, and you have to mitigate for the impacts, and you still are beholden to the various buffers and so on and so forth. And if you have to encroach upon a buffer in order to achieve, then you need to offset that somehow.
Perfect.
We also look at all of this through the lens of all of what we're talking about, through the lens of the Growth Management Act. I didn't even want to go there and talk about that today, but we have a lot of rules, regulations, and limitations with regard to the Growth Management Act.
This is another question. Could the county provide incentives to commercial owners for conversions I'm assuming commercial properties and to convert them into residential properties. And would this be a good use of funds in your opinions?
So the initial thought that I would have that's a possibility, which we'd have to do more research on, is just recently in the last legislative session, counties were given the opportunity to access a multifamily tax credit or tax incentive, so that only cities used to be able to do that. I think Bremerton and Port Orchard have a couple different projects where they provided a tax break to developers creating those multifamily units and affordable housing. So it's possible. I don't know if it extends to the conversion and redevelopment of a commercial property versus new housing units. I don't know. It's a great question, but that's probably our only path. Would be some type of tax credit if the multifamily one works for that.
And we took years and years and years to get this passed by our state legislature, the multifamily tax credit, and it's a huge tool in the toolbox, I think, for moving forward. In addition to moving forward towards affordable housing and incentives, I think we have to incentivize instead of penalize, if we can do it.
And there are restrictions based on the location of where that property would be. Related to transit, so on and so forth. So it's got to tick a few boxes before it would actually be eligible.
Yeah, unless government subsidizes in some way, it just doesn't pencil for these developers. The cost of development now is huge, going up, and what they can get in rent just doesn't make the difference in giving them some sort of level of profit off the thing. So, I mean, I know in Bremerton a couple of times we've done a waived property tax for 10-year period, that sort of thing, which worked in a couple of cases. We got nice projects because of that. So that kind of thing seems to me has to be part of the whole idea of building affordable housing. There probably has to be subsidy somewhere or another.
Sounds like a topic that needs more exploration.
I think so. There's so many aspects of the whole process that have to be investigated that it's something that would take, we might be able to write another book. Here's another question. Could the county provide incentives? Oh, I'm sorry. Can anything be done at the Kitsap County level to encourage financial institutions to lend to middle income buyers?
We really don't have that jurisdiction.
Authority.
We don't have any involvement in lending.
And banks, and they are probably under a whole nother regulatory process. This is one on transportation. We can increase the size of roads to try to deal with congestion, but research indicates that approach will simply draw more traffic. Has there been any consideration of a local fast ferry system between different parts of the county? For example, Bainbridge Island, Kingston, which reminiscent of the old mosquito fleet, and with the ferries to be met by a dial-a-ride type bus, it would reduce both road congestion and pollution.
Commissioners, I'd like to jump out because I see Rob smiling and Charlotte smiling. We just had this discussion yesterday. Kitsap Transit, yes, we had a discussion yesterday, and I propose or would like to see a design and some plans for maybe a service from Silverdale to Bremerton, much like the mosquito fleet, or I should say Port Orchard to Bremerton, in terms of, I think that this is going to the question, but let's continue exploring that and do something about it. Maybe not just, maybe there's, actually we talked about, or Commissioner Gelder talked about maybe one from Bainbridge to, not sure where, to Kingston.
Well, yeah, I threw out the idea. So, it would be cool to have a little triangle route, right, from Bainbridge to Bremerton to Port Orchard. Because if you're serving on jury duty and you live on Bainbridge, and then you've got to drive all the way around to actually meet that. But if you could
thinking out of the box, yeah.
Well, but
I think Kitsap Transit is actually beginning to have some of these, maybe not quite as ambitious as what we're talking today, but I think they're creative.
And I think some of these ideas you could think about privatizing some of this. BC Ferries has been a semi-private operation for years and years. And what's the ferry that runs out of downtown Seattle that goes up to Victoria? I think that's private.
The Clipper.
Yeah. So there might be a public-private kind of partnership here that might make some of that work.
Barry, did you
Well,
want to?
I know that on a regional level, the Puget Sound Regional Council has sponsored, and I don't know what its fate is right now because of COVID, a regional passenger-only ferry process, study group, whatever, to try to look at where that makes sense. And I think the more that's built into our understanding of transportation, the more likely it is that people will say, hey, I could go from Silverdale to Bainbridge, and it becomes all part of an evolution in how we move.
It just boils down to ultimately funding, right? Because there was the 3/10 that went specifically to the fast ferries, and that ask of the voters was specifically about a cross-sound service.
Yes.
We really have to understand the funding and what it would require to do an intra-county type of service akin to the mosquito fleet.
And still, we are a peninsula, and we do have lots of waterway.
Yes, we do. But it would seem to me that if you do have a mosquito fleet, well, you just use that term analogy, because it harkens some rather, I guess, romantic ideas in our minds about these little boats that went from port to port. However, then I think we would have to have what Mary has suggested for Kingston, and that is some sort of a shuttle service that can get you from that ferry landing or the boat landing, whatever that happens to be, in some cases, to the business sector.
Sure.
So that would have to be, I think, another consideration, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Right. The intermodality, we'll call it, of all the handoffs.
Now, there's a word for you.
There we go. Well, and I think that my other question would be, what is our trade-off environmentally? Because if we're putting boats in the water, we know that there will be pollution that is resultant from those boats. Is that worse or better than what is being caused by cars?
And it really depends on, are you putting diesel-fueled boats on the water, and what is that doing? Not only from noise, but the exhaust, et cetera. But even Skagit County has been working on the development of an all-electric, because they have a county-run ferry up to Guaymas Island that they serve back and forth, and they've been trying to electrify that route so that it definitely has a less of an environmental impact. And of course, State Ferries is trying to move in that direction, and and we even Kitsap Transit has some amount of investment in hybrid and or all electric,
and continuing to further develop that Kitsap Transit.
Mm-hmm.
This is going back to housing. Can you give a price as to what you consider affordable for housing? Is it $300,000, $400,000, or what?
I think we alluded earlier before, when it comes to really affordability, it depends on the person, right? How do you define affordable is really based on the buyer. Usually when we're talking about affordable, which maybe we need to come up with another word, right? I think when something gets used too much, it kind of loses its meaning. But affordability often at least from the government standpoint, is really driven by what's the funding source. Because you're then trying to define affordable based on a certain population and their area median income, and where do they fall on the range? Are you talking about 30% AMI or 60%, 80%? So there's all these different segments of it that you're talking about affordable, but it's going to be different for everybody. Even for the double income, household, what is that based on their household income, and is it driven by square footage? I think that's really a conversation we need to have. Is about the square footage of our housing stock in our community, because that truly drives what's affordable from a construction standpoint, but also a long-term ownership standpoint.
Yeah, we probably use the word affordable more than any other word during our panel discussion today. And to this day, I'm still confused and don't like the word affordable housing, because the Commissioner Gelder said, are we talking about two families working and can barely make it? Are we talking about homelessness? Are we talking about other individuals that are getting ready to be evicted? I would be guesstimating to give a number of what affordable means, because I don't know what it means.
It has to be related to income, because if you don't have the income to be able to afford, it's not affordable.
That's right. And one of the measures they use is it should only, no more than 40% of your income should have to go to paying for where you live. 35, 40%, I don't know. But these numbers vary. I think 300, if you had an average cost of a home in a community and it was 300,000, 350, that'd be pretty affordable in today's world. But those houses that were in the real world, those houses were 350 5 years ago, they're 850. That's not affordable. So some way you've got to get housing on the market that meets what the average income in your community can afford to pay on a monthly basis, and still buy groceries and get to work and have their health insurance. That would be affordable. But I agree with you, Ed. I mean, there's 100 definitions.
You're right. It's a term that is very nebulous, and we throw it around a lot. I think in terms of qualifying for a mortgage, back in the old days, it was 30% of your income could not be. I think total income, 30% was for your debt, and 25% of that could be housing. I think that has probably changed over the decades.
30%.
I apologize. I apologize. I've got to take off. I've got a 1:00 board meeting, and I thought we were going to 12:30. Happy to be here.
Yes.
But, thank you for me anyway.
Thank you so much for
and thank you for all of you and the league for being there. But I'm going to have to sign off, and hopefully it doesn't snow tonight.
Happy holidays, Ed.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So I want to go back to the affordability question. I just spent some time in Veterans Park this weekend, Saturday, with a group of folks cleaning up from the people who are living outside in the park. There are probably well over 50 people who are living there. And we talked to them, many of them who would wish to come inside, agreed that if a building could be made available for them to live in, that they would be willing to live inside. But they just cannot afford any place to live other than outside right now.
Or their cars.
Yeah.
Big issues. We have so many of them to cover. We've hit all of the questions that people have in the chat. And I know you all are very busy people and have a lot to work on. I want to thank you so much for your time. It's an important discussion, and I really, really appreciate the fact that you're here to help us understand and see what the county can and cannot do. And hopefully we can do this again. And as I said that, there were 3 new messages. Oh, they're all saying thank you, thank you, thank you. So we do.
And thank you.
And we will sign off and hopefully can do some more of these informative sessions. Especially, I like the idea of the middle
income.
Missing middle. I think that's a really wonderful
Great.
idea to further the discussion on housing.
Real quickly, one thing we didn't talk about that touches on all this is we're living in this pandemic, and that's impacting everything we're talking about today.
Indeed.
It is. And 1918, that was 2 years of pandemic, and we're pushing that now. So hopefully history will inform us on the way this one will go too. We'll keep our fingers crossed on that.
Thank you. You did a great job.
You did.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye,
You too.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.